Okay, I'm going to call the meeting of May 17th, 2018 Delta Protection Commission. We're going to call to order and have a salute to the flag. And since Mayor Cott is sworn in now, we'll have you do our pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I want to welcome everybody to the commission meeting, and if we can have the roll call, please. Just tell me to slow down, Ashley.
Chair Thompson,
Here?
Vice Chair Villegas,
Here.
Commissioner Burgess. Here. Commissioner Cott.
Here.
Commissioner Biaggi.
Here.
Commissioner Van Lobenzels.
Here.
Commissioner Flournoy.
Here.
Commissioner Moffett. Here. Commissioner Ferrara.
Here.
Did I get everybody? I think that was everybody, right?
Commissioner Loftus.
Oh, Commissioner Loftus. Here. Thank you.
Okay.
I thought I missed.
Is that everyone? We have a
We have
quorum?
a quorum.
Okay, thank you. Before we get started, we have two new members I'd like to introduce. My colleague, the Mayor of Rio Vista, Ron Cott, and from Transportation, Marlon Flournoy. Any comments, gentlemen?
Well, I'm just kind of excited to be here. Rio Vista is, we're really concerned about what's happening in the Delta. We're kind of at the end of whatever happens. So I'm great to be able to represent the city in this commission. So thank you very much.
Marlon?
I'm happy to be here, and it's an honor to serve with you all.
And Mr. Chair, welcome the new members. We did have one other commission member present at roll call, and that's Dean Ruiz, who is sitting in tonight for Commissioner Ferguson, and we welcome him.
All right, thank you. And one other announcement, our colleague Chris Trinnell has a new position. He's deputy, make sure I have this correct, he's Deputy Secretary of State, of DWR. So congratulations to Chris. So with that said, public comment. Do we have anyone wishes to address the commission on items not on the agenda? Any cards? It's item 10. Any cards?
Cards for public comment, Ashley.
Just the one I gave you.
Okay, very good. Seeing none, we'll move on. Item 4, consent. Any discussion on the consent? Do I have a motion to approve? Moved by Villegas, second by Burgess. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Unanimous, thank you. Executive Director's Report. Erik?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and commission members. A brief report tonight. I'll hit on just a few items that are in the written report. The first is that we're well underway with our update of the Commission's Land Use and Resource Management Plan. And we've been meeting with different Delta stakeholders, getting feedback on our proposed chapters for the Land Use Plan update. And we're looking at 6 different chapters. We've grouped those in pairs and have had 2 of 3 of these sessions so far. We'll have the 3rd coming up here in a little over a week. And our intention is to take that information and incorporate it into a draft document. And we're probably several months away from that, but we anticipate by the end of the summer we'll be moving at a pretty good clip on the update of the Land Use and Resource Management Plan. We've talked with the Commission at the last meeting about the work on the Delta Sign Plan, and this is a joint effort with the Delta Conservancy that is intended to create better signage in the Delta region. We have a lot of people that travel around the edges of the Delta that really don't know what wonders await them just a few miles off of our interstates and highways. And the signage plan is intended to help get people keyed into the fact that there's some pretty nice things out here and direct them toward the interior of the Delta. The comments on that plan are due by tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken on that, Stacy. I know they were due about a week ago, and there was an extension of the comment deadline. By the time the commission next meets in July, we'll be right on the heels of our Delta Heritage Forum. This is scheduled for July 20th. It will be at the Gene Harvey Center in Walnut Grove. Just an opportunity to bring together people who are interested in Delta heritage, historic preservation, and provide opportunities for partnerships and collaboration. The Commission's been active in providing comments to the Delta Science Program on the Delta Science Plan update. This is a document that's updated, I believe, every 5 years. Our role there is really just to encourage the Delta Science Program that there are a lot of social science-related needs, research needs related to what we call Delta as place, how best to protect and enhance the unique Delta values of agriculture, recreation, and Delta culture. And so not many people speak up for those in this process, and we're a voice for that, as we always are for those particular topics. So we will continue to advocate for the Delta Science Program to include those type of research topics in their plans and in this 2018 update. A pretty quiet couple of months on the land use front, just a couple of comment letters. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have on those. And then I always like to end my report by just drawing everyone's attention to upcoming events in the Delta. And now that we're here in spring, even though it feels a little summer-like today, and moving into the summer months, there is a lot of activity throughout the Delta, and I'd encourage everyone to take a look at those upcoming events and take advantage of an opportunity to attend a good community event or a whole host of things. Almost on every weekend, there's something interesting happening within the Delta. And with that, Mr. Chair, that concludes my report.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Any questions, comments on the report? Anyone from the public wishing to comment on this item? Seeing none. Thank you, Eric. Moving on to item 6, we're going to receive a Delta Protection Advisory Committee report, and Barbara Daly, the vice chair, is going to make that presentation.
The microphone's there, Barbara.
Hello, my name is Barbara Daly. I'm on the DPAC committee. I'm the vice chair, and I'm speaking for Mark Pruner tonight, who is our chairman. He can't be here tonight. And this Delta Protection and Advisory Committee report was prepared by Erik Vink for me to read to you. The Delta Protection Advisory Committee met on April 26th at the Isleton Chamber of Commerce office. DPAC heard an update on Delta Protection Commission staff activities, provided input on the Land Use and Resource Management Plan update, which was discussing legacy communities in the primary zone, continued its discussion on a recommendation on how best to protect and enhance the unique Delta values in the Delta Plan, heard an update on the Delta signage plan from the Delta Conservancy, and heard an update on 2016 Delta agricultural statistics.
Short and sweet.
Short and sweet, even though we were there 2 hours.
Any questions for Barbara? Barbara, thank you and the committee for all the work you do.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to item 7. We're going to receive a report on nutria by Martha Wilcoff and Valerie Cook-Fletcher. Is that correct? Okay.
So I'm Martha Wilcoff. I work for the Department of Fish and Wildlife's Invasive Species Program. Thank you for the invitation to present to you tonight. Thank you. And I've got Valerie Cook-Fletcher, who is a environmental scientist, senior environmental scientist in our program. So we're working in our department on this project. Is it up there? Okay. So this began back in March of 2007. A wildlife services trapper was doing work out in the San Joaquin Valley, trapping beaver for depredation purposes. And in that trapping effort, he captured a mammal that wasn't a beaver. Turns out it was a nutria. And so that's where we began with this undertaking. A little bit about background about the nutria. It's a mammal native to South America. It's semi-aquatic. It is obligate to aquatic environments, both freshwater and brackish. So there's, as you can imagine, much habitat throughout the Central Valley of California. It was introduced back in the early 30s and 40s across the U.S. For the fur trade. Back then it was considered kind of a low level, relative to mink, inexpensive fur for the average market. That market never really panned out, and so that cottage industry in that fur production, and as a result of those farms shutting down, animals were released into the environment, including in California, as well as some other states where they have established over since that time. And I'll talk about a few of those locations. So that was the case here in California, and the Department of Food and Ag went in and removed those last animals and declared them eradicated in the early 70s. So since then, there have been no reports of nutria in the state. Can you back up a couple of slides just to make sure I hit everything on there? There was also some interest in nutria as a means for aquatic vegetation control back in those days, but never really was anything adopted by any agencies relative to management. Okay, next please. They're a rodent, so like many other species of rodents, they reach sexual maturity at a young age, in the case of nutria, between 4 to 6 months. And the females can produce up to 3 litters per year, ranging in a number of offspring from 5 to up to 13 on average. They live in social groups, which is different than some of our native mammals like beaver. So these animals can concentrate in colonies, further exacerbating their impacts in an environment. They also are capable of dispersing up to 50 miles. Of course, I think that's habitat dependent, so that's based on other locations where nutria are known. So because of our interconnected waterways here in California, there's a lot of potential for nutria to disperse from any one point. Their average home range size, so basically the area that a animal might move about, is about a quarter of an acre, or I'm sorry, 25 acres. And they can move daily 2 miles, but I've heard up to 6 miles in some radio telemetry work. There's evidence in other locations. We don't have any such information for here in California, but we do hope to develop it as we move forward with this effort. And again, freshwater and brackish habitats. Next, please. So nutria are very similar in appearance to some of our native wildlife, and so they can be difficult to distinguish from other species. So in this photograph on the right, I'm sorry, your left, is a beaver on the far left. A nutria is the second over to the right. The third is a groundhog, which we don't have here in California. And on the far right is a muskrat. And for illustration purposes, this nutria has a shortened tail due to frostbite. This photo is from the East Coast, where they do suffer frost damage. We have developed this flyer on the right side in an effort to educate folks about how to identify a nutria accurately, either in the field or if they've captured one. Distinguished primarily by white whiskers, not just a white muzzle, but a white whiskers. Beaver can have white muzzles as well, but not the white whiskers. And then the shape of the tail is also kind of one of the primary distinguishing characteristics, along with some other features that are more detailed. Next. So the impacts of nutria, this is really what it's all about. Nutria aren't native to this area, and our engineered system is really poorly prepared for their impacts, as well as our native ecosystems. Nutria are heavy feeders and very destructive feeders. So they don't just nibble at the leaves, they uproot the emergent vegetation and eat the basal portions of those. So in the process, killing that plant, and then the leftovers, the less palatable parts of, in this top photo, cattails, are left, which also turns out to be a good sign of their presence. So as we go out and look, we're looking for this type of damage. Muskrats can do similar damage, and that's when you get into the details of looking at those plants and cuttings to be able to distinguish whether it was muskrat or potentially nutria. So this feeding can result in severe erosion of soils and emergent vegetation, and ultimately, if the impacts are heavy enough, result in the loss of those emergent plants and opening up of the wetlands into open water. This is significant for a lot of our waterfowl in the Central Valley because they depend on habitat that's more complex than just open water. So an example of that is in the lower photo, which was probably taken in the winter. The second sort of characteristic of nutria are their burrowing into levees and embankments. So, of course, in the Delta and the Central Valley, we have miles and miles of these banks that are susceptible to nutria damage. They may create burrows that are 3 to 18 feet in depth and then extend. If there's large colonies, these burrows can get complex and intermingled. So really that causes instability of those banks and anything dependent on those levees. So some other examples throughout the country where nutria have really made significant environmental impacts. The first example is Louisiana. And you can see in these photos examples of the damage and compared to areas that is not as heavily impacted by nutria. And then an exclusion just to show when you exclude nutria what the habitat would otherwise be like without their presence. So in Louisiana, they haven't committed to an eradication, that they've determined that to be infeasible. However, they do have an ongoing control program where they've put bounties on the tails to incentivize the harvest of nutria, just for population control and to reduce impacts. So they've committed up $24 million since 2002 on this control program alone. The next example is the Chesapeake Bay. This is a pre-nutria saturation on the photo in the left in 1939, and then they experienced a boom in the population in the 80s, which ultimately culminated in their eradication program, which has been going on for the last 12 or 14 years, and they are reaching the point at which they're preparing to declare eradication. An important distinction between Chesapeake Bay and California is that they have harsh winters, and these are tropical or semi-tropical species who are not tolerant to the cold. So their populations are knocked back, and they're not breeding year-round like they have the potential to in California. So that really has aided in their eradication effort. This effort has been led by the states and implemented by USDA Wildlife Services. And over the past 15 years, they've invested, federal government has funded much of this, over $15 million with a current annual budget of 1.5 or thereabouts. So the benefits of nutria removal. This is from Chesapeake Bay, showing a nutria impacted location, and then that same site after recovery and restoration. We don't have any natural predators or unnatural predators for nutria in California, so we can't depend on any natural means for controlling their population. Within their native range, they're prey to caiman and big cats and hunters. Louisiana, of course, they have the bounty program and alligators and maybe some predatory fish. Chesapeake Bay, they've got their eradication program as their primary means for nutria removal, with probably some limited wildlife. In California, we don't anticipate that coyotes or mountain lions would be a huge, predator, and certainly not with the reproductive rate of nutria. We wouldn't anticipate that they could be much help in keeping a population in check. We have made some interesting observations as well about where nutria are present and what other wildlife is present with them. And typically on the cameras we've set out, we don't see a lot of overlap between nutria presence and other species. And again, they live in large family groups, so it may be a factor of other animals just aren't interested in occupying the same area. Next. So my program is all about invasive species, and we seek to prevent their introduction, control those species that are here in the state that are beyond eradication, and pursuing eradication if it's a feasible option. So in the case of nutria, we feel we're early in the introduction and establishment of the species in the state, and therefore think eradication is a realistic goal. As with that reproductive rate, our opportunity, we feel, to implement a successful eradication quickly is, as time goes on, gets smaller and smaller, our window of opportunity. So at some point, a species occupies or saturates the environment, essentially. And for a species like nutria and all the resources we have in California, we expect that carrying capacity for our environment and our agriculture, because they will feed on the agriculture as well, to be very high. So we would expect high densities if this population is allowed to persist. Next, please. So in California, I will defer questions to Valerie about the discoveries, but I'll hit the main points here. As I mentioned at the beginning, the first nutria was captured in March of last year. That was a pregnant female. Since that time, we've taken over 50 animals in 6 counties, and this slide is outdated. So Stanislaus, Merced, Fresno, Tuolumne, and Mariposa, and San Joaquin now, which I think spurred the invitation today. Those animals have been juveniles, adults, males, females, pregnant females. One of our top sized animal, and I should have included a picture of it, was a 24.6 pound female. So that's the largest animal. That's a big rodent. And she was pregnant as well, so we caught her just in time. And these animals have been captured on federal, state, and private lands, on rivers, canals, roadkill even. We've got 2 animals that have been hit. So we're really across the spectrum of locations and growing, unfortunately. Next. So the ones closest to your area of particular significance have occurred just in the last month. We have had 2 nutria detected in San Joaquin County. One was brought in to a property owner by their dog. They didn't believe their dog killed that animal, but it brought it to their house. And the second was captured by a animal control employee about a half mile off of the San Joaquin River under a car. And that animal wasn't identified at the time, taken back to the river and released. We got some really great pictures of it, but unfortunately, that animal is back out in the environment. And I believe the next slide is a little bit closer detail of those locations. And let's see, I know the one under the car is and that is Middle and Old River. Okay. Next, please. So really the take-home in the early part, when I talked about the biology of the animal, these are 2 that have been discovered in San Joaquin County, but we have populations we know are producing in San Joaquin County, upriver, and so the dispersal of those animals is very likely downstream to the delta. So how has the state responded? Back in March, we pulled together other agencies, had a first meeting. At that time, we didn't know that was a pregnant female nutria captured, so we all were crossing our fingers. Maybe it's just somebody's released pet. Maybe this isn't a population. And we had set out remote cameras in the area, trying to pick up any indication of additional animals. It turned out at that meeting, we viewed some cards from cameras, and indeed there were more nutria photographed. So in partnership with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, USDA, APHIS, Food and Agriculture, we had some representatives from the Merced Ag Commissioner's Office, Department of Parks and Recreation, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Water Resources. We've convened a group who has met monthly or bi-monthly since then, talking about what our response will be and what the different agencies can contribute to this effort. We've also, at that time, set out more cameras, started surveys, started trapping animals, because every animal that we're able to remove from the landscape is an animal that's not reproducing and contributing to the population. And we're also working on, now as we're getting really into implementation, our resources are stretched, our staff is stretched, but our goal is to develop an implementation plan. We have, the Department of Fish and Wildlife has formalized an incident command system within our agency, and this has enabled us to redirect resources from throughout the department to work on this response. Next, please. So to date, we are trapping, surveying, doing outreach to local landowners. Media has been phenomenally important. Through media, we've gotten more reports from the public. So that has been very helpful because we don't have the staff really to saturate all of the potential habitat. We're working with the programs in Maryland, Louisiana, Oregon, Washington, on their nutria efforts, so we aren't reinventing the wheel. We aren't, wasting time trying to figure it out when we can draw from the experience of others. We're also pursuing funding at every opportunity. And again, under the ICS, we're redirecting staff and resources. We're also working, one of our primary, most important objectives right now is getting permission from private landowners to access their land. So that's something that our partners can be very helpful to us with securing. And again, working on that eradication plan. Next. I won't get into too many details about our eradication approach, but really we're looking for the tools that we can use that are most efficient and effective based on that Chesapeake Bay model for their eradication. And we're very aware and sensitive to take of non-target species. So we're selecting gear, placing gear as best we can to avoid non-target take. We get a lot of questions about, can I hunt them? Can I take them? And in evaluating where they fall in the Fish and Game Code, they're a non-game, non-fur-bearing species, so they can be taken by landowners or their agents by any means, but they're not a game species. Next. This is a bit about the Chesapeake strategy and the strategy we'll be modeling. They have a 5-phase approach, which starts with surveying and delineation, knockdown, so basically removing kind of as many animals quickly as you can, and then going back and mopping up those, the remaining individuals, followed by let's see, what's the next one? Verification, so continuing to look at the habitat and validating that there are not animals in there. And then the final step is long-term ongoing monitoring to, again, verify that all animals have been removed. What you don't want to do in an eradication is prematurely declare success, only to have animals emerge, and that makes for a difficult, sell on your efforts. So better to be cautious and sure when you make that declaration. And that's the extent of mine. Questions?
Any questions? George?
Do they eat hyacinth?
I don't know that they will.
Let's
They
hope
may.
They do.
Hyacinth.
Why don't you come to the mic, please?
Martha mentioned that they really like the succulent parts of the plant. I think that they would probably really like water hyacinth, but I think they would exacerbate the population by causing all the fragmentation. Valerie Cook-Fletcher, by the way.
Okay, thank you. Todd?
Thank you. Martha is it on? Martha, hello? Can you guys hear me? Yeah? Martha did a nice job of really kind of explaining the issue. I will just underscore that the discovery of nutria in California really alarmed a lot of folks that we work with. Not only are they so prolific and destructive, their establishment here in the Delta in particular could be quite consequential. And to that point, last month, the Delta Conservancy awarded a Proposition 1 grant of over, I believe is $1.1 million toward this eradication effort in order to really propel it. So I just wanted to make sure folks are aware of that activity as well.
So have we talked with the Army Corps of Engineer about the levees in the nutria?
We have not engaged with the Corps of Engineers to date. We are working with Department of Water Resources, but I appreciate they have different authorities, and I will take a note of that. Thank you.
Diane?
So it says that we eradicated them in 1970s. What's different as far as the conditions? What did we do to eradicate them then?
So that was Department of Food and Agriculture was actually responsible for that. Their records are incomplete in terms of what that eradication program was. We have some notes essentially from a staff person back then, but we don't have a good picture because the institutional knowledge is gone from their agency. So I'm afraid I can't tell you much. They were trapping and probably taking them by firearm, I would guess, back in the day.
Okay, and kind of following the question before, I think it'd be really good for us to be reaching out to all the different levees, all the reclamation districts, and putting them on alert, and more eyeballs looking can be helpful.
Yes, absolutely.
Don?
Just a quick question. So landowners can take them, do they need to report that to you if they do, or they just dispose of the carcass appropriately? And
We would appreciate very much receiving information that they were taken, and if we can get the carcass, we're doing necropsies, looking at the sex, the maturity, the age of the animals to help try to determine if those animals were dispersing or if there's a reproducing population.
And have you then worked with your local farm bureaus, with your animal care agencies, control agencies in the areas so that everybody's kind of put on notice that in the event that somebody shows up with one of them, or they've one's found dead on a road, or whatever, that they know that you folks are the point of contact for that information?
Yes, we have reached out to the animal control groups via our enforcement. So there's a nexus between our wardens and those local jurisdictions and capacities. So we hope that we don't end up with another release of an unknown animal.
And how about your local farm bureaus and other organizations where folks are, they get their information, I'm sure, from different sources, but that's a good way to communicate with folks who are out on the ground, maybe, irrigating and or do levee patrol during certain times of the year and so forth?
Yes, we're working with the California Agricultural Commissioners, and so I'm sensing that they're a separate entity than the Farm Bureaus, or they may not be an effective conduit of information to the Farm Bureaus.
I think your ag commissioners are in contact with your farm bureaus generally, but I just asking that because you're trying to, stop the spread here. I think it's important for you folks to, know that you have allies out there if they know what they're looking for and how to cooperate with you, so.
Yes, we've engaged with those groups. We've had one meeting in Merced with ag commissioners. Valerie's going to the county ag commissioner annual meeting next week, I think. And we've been trying to cover and present at as many venues as we can, certainly. And we have a web page that we're continuing to develop and update with the new information on discoveries. We've created some outreach materials that we are distributing as well. Thank you.
Dean?
Yes. You mentioned Louisiana, they don't consider eradication feasible. Was there a point at which they did consider it feasible? Did something get out of hand, or are there lessons to be learned from what happened or didn't happen there?
Well, I think the lesson to learn is they're spending millions of dollars per year just on control, and they still have rampant damage by nutria. I think by the time, I can't speak for them, but I think by the time they realized the impacts, it was more of an investment to eradicate than they could garner support for. And so hence my encouragement that we take care of this at the earliest time possible, because the costs for ongoing maintenance or ongoing control for a species like this are going to be in the millions of dollars annually, versus investing millions of dollars up front to deal with and avoiding those perpetual impacts over time.
Any other questions?
Yeah, just to follow up, thank you, Martha, for your presentation. I'm with the Department of Food and Agriculture, and sorry about our record keeping from the 1970s, apparently. But yes, this is a very important issue that our department, along with you guys, have been taking up. We did rate this as a Class A pest back in August of last year. We've been partnering with them. Our vertebrate pest detection program has been doing a lot of the pest detection, not necessarily the trapping, but the monitoring, so that we are partnering closely with them on that. But as far as the Farm Bureau question, we have been and engaged with the California Farm Bureau Federation on that, and I'm sure they're also disseminating that to their local farm bureaus as well. This Senate has, I had a hearing just 2 days ago on this issue, so it has elevated a lot of attention throughout the state, especially members of the Senate, as well as others, administration.
Other questions?
Just a comment to append on to that. And by the way, a request for all commission members to speak closely to the mic. We do record these meetings, and there are actually people who listen to them after we post them on YouTube. It's amazing. Senator Galgiani, who's our ex officio member, did convene that hearing a couple of days ago. And I also wanted to note that, and I appreciate Commissioner Ferrara's comment about the Delta Conservancy grant, but there's also funding in the governor's revised budget through the Department of Food and Agriculture. And these invasive pests, it's kind of a tag team effort between Department of Food and Agriculture, and at least in the case of this creature, the Department of Fish and Wildlife. But there is funding in the governor's revised budget, and I believe it made it through the committee today to provide Food and Ag with funding to work on this issue over the next couple of years. So the resources are coming into play, but I appreciate the comments about what should people look for and who should they contact, because we need as many eyes and ears on the ground to keep an eye out on this problem and let these folks know when they detect a problem occurring.
Any other questions?
Just a quick comment, maybe just to underscore what Commissioner Burgess said earlier and what you just said, and depending on what your eradication efforts might look like, there's actually another opportunity that is going to be almost free, and that would be using applications that are available out there with people with their phones. If they see something, they can literally click on a link that allows them to send their location, exactly where they're at, to a particular location that then could be responded to. So depending on what your eradication efforts might look like, that might be another opportunity, as I said, that's almost virtually free, so something
Sure.
to think about.
We do have a hotline and an email address not dedicated to our invasive species program, and those are what we disseminate as reporting. We have been working on getting an app for reporting invasive species, and we continue to try to get that through our process.
Chuck?
We do have an app that we have for insect species, and we can look into adding nutria into that.
Chuck?
I'd just like to commend Food and Agriculture and Fish and Wildlife, because George and I sit on the County Ag Advisory Commission, which meets monthly, and the Ag Commissioner makes a report on this, which then informs the commission itself. But on top of that, he also attends, and I attend, the Farm Bureau Board of Directors meeting every month. So the information that you're feeding him is going directly into the farmers and ag and dairy, the growers and dairy owners, and then it's going to the Farm Bureau. So as you keep information going to him, it goes to us. So I just want to thank you for your efforts, because it is making a difference.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chuck. Okay, any other questions, comments?
Just a quick comment. So you do not support catch and release,
Make
though,
sure you
right?
speak into the mic.
You don't support catch and release?
For this species?
Right. Well, because I see that in the examples in our packet that somebody caught it and then released it back into the river.
Right.
By mistake.
Yes, no.
Not being humorous.
Oh, is that a joke?
Pretty serious.
Got to lighten up a little bit, I guess. We're done.
I guess.
All right. Any other comments or questions? Anyone from the public wish to comment? Yes, ma'am. If you could go to the mic.
Can I take
You
it,
take
George?
it.
Please do. Yeah, thank you. Mike travels. So just hold it out. There you go.
I was just wondering, are any tribal lands affected by this? And if so, have you reached out to the tribes?
Thank you. To our knowledge, no.
What was the question?
Has this affected any tribal lands? And if so, have we engaged?
Okay. Diane?
Okay. Trying to speak in the microphone too. I wasn't really able to kind of track, is it going in different directions as far as what you're seeing, or is it going one direction as far as new sightings, or is there any pattern there?
I can't say we have enough information to be able to tell you that. A lot of our sightings have been rather anecdotal, so it's not a case where we really have a good understanding of where they are currently or where they were when we began our efforts. So unfortunately not, but I'm going, as a scientist and using kind of common sense, my expectation is that they will tend to go downstream. Maybe some upstream, but it takes more effort for an animal to go upstream than it does downstream. The one animal that was brought in as a carcass in San Joaquin County, that was a young male. He was reproductively mature, but small for his size. So we're hoping that animal was dispersing from another population and not an animal from a population that has established in the Delta.
Anyone else from the public? Yes, if you go to the microphone, please.
Microphone. Thanks, Kat.
First of all, is how are the animals trapped? Are they trapped live and then euthanized somewhere else? And the ID flyer, do you have any of those with you?
Currently, we're using live traps to trap the animals and then dispatching those animals on site. The initial animals we were capturing and any new animals from new locations are being necropsied by our veterinarian for disease surveillance and health and condition. All other animals are being necropsied for sex and age. We are looking at other trap types to increase our efficiency and efficacy. Again, working around avoidance of non-targets. Your second question was relative to our flyers, and unfortunately, we didn't bring any today, but I would be happy to mail you out some. I'll give you my card. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
The microphone, CG. Thank you. No one avoids the mic.
I regret to inform
Can everyone,
you-
can you introduce yourself too? We should ask everyone speaking to state their name for the record.
Sorry, Cece Giacomo. I'm sorry to bring bad tidings, but a nutria was sighted on Sherman Island approximately 3 years ago in a slough by a person that's lived all over the world, especially in the tropics, and was familiar with the species.
Okay, thank you. I would encourage any reports to be submitted either to the Department of Fish and Wildlife now or in the past, and we can see about following up on those reports.
Okay. Yes, sir. Up to the mic.
Hi, my name's David Castro Giovanni, and I have a two-part question. My question is are there any metrics that talk about how many individuals in a litter, how many litters per year, and how many potential litters a female can have in a lifetime? The second part of the question is if that metric is available, is there any data that supports what the rate of infestation expansion is going to be? Thank you.
Yes. So reproductively mature at 6 months? 4 to 6 months. Up to 3 litters in 13 months. Litter sizes of 4 to 13. Average 6. We have modeled a growth curve for this species based on those numbers, and I can't tell you what, do you recall what the 1 year, 2 year, at 5 years it was up to hundreds of thousands of animals.
Yeah, the estimate ranged from anywhere from 40 to 200,000.
So estimating that reproductive rate after 5 years, starting with 50 animals, was between 40 to 200,000 nutria.
Any other questions? Well, good questions from the audience. Thanks for participating.
Thank you very much for having me.
Martha, thank you. I appreciate it, and Valerie as well. Okay. Okay, now we hit the highlight of the night, the Delta Leadership Program presentations. So Erik, do you want to take it from here?
Yes, I would, Mr. Chair. So this is the third group of our Delta Leadership Program. We call it Delta Leadership Program 2018. And as most commission members recall, this is our program that we conduct in concert with the Delta Regional Foundation. And I'm very pleased that Monty Van Camp Condos, the president of the Delta Regional Foundation, is here with us this evening. This year we had 13 participants in the Delta Leadership Program. Over the course of 5 day-long seminars, we introduced our participants to policy issues of importance in the Delta region. We did a little work with them on enabling them to be better spokespeople for their occupation or their community or whatever it was that made a connection in the Delta. And then they worked on class projects as well, and you'll hear brief presentations on those class projects this evening. I'll invite one by one a representative from each of those teams to make the presentation. But suffice it to say, this is one of the highlights for me of the year, is being able to work with our participants in this program. We have some very esteemed alumni from the program, including Commissioner Wynn and Commissioner Van Lobensel's. And we have members of our Delta Protection Advisory Committee, that including some who spoke here this evening, Barbara Daly and Kathy Button. It's something we're very interested in perpetuating, and I look forward to reporting on our next year's program, which will probably start a little bit earlier. That was some good feedback we received from this year's program. So, Mr. Chair, without any further ado, and by the way, I will direct the commission members to the second page in the packet lists the 13 participants. We always do our best to really ensure a good geographic distribution throughout the Delta region. And this page will tell you the names of the participants and their affiliation. Not all of them are here this evening, but we will make presentations to about 8 of our participants, legislative commendations that I'll ask the chair and Monty Van Camp-Condos to present to the participants. So with that, Mr. Chair, may I introduce, or if you have a question or comment?
Let me just make a brief comment. I was privileged to be part of a panel that critiqued the first go-around, and I think the subjects that they've selected are really going to be helpful to the Delta Protection Commission. So I know they've done a great job of tightening up the time, because Erik told them to, I believe. But you did a good job, and I'm glad you're here to make your presentation.
And our clerk does have copies of these presentations, and we'll start with the one on Chris Valley. Are you okay to start? We'll start with the one on the illegal dumping and trash removal in the Delta. And with that, I'll introduce Chris Valley, who's the captain of scientific research vessels for U.S. Geological Survey. We were fortunate to go out on a boat tour of the North Delta thanks to Chris this year, and with that, I will turn it over to him.
Welcome, Chris.
All right. Good evening, and thank you guys all for being here. Thank you very much for what you do. It's great to be in a room full of people that are all pushing the envelope for something that we care deeply about. The presentation and group project that we chose for the DPC course was trash removal. Our group is the Trash Talkers. I'm Chris Valley. We have Brian Bush. He's here as well. We also have Jack Zach, and Kim Vilosena, excuse me if I'm pronouncing the name wrong. They weren't able to make it, but again, thank you. This project, the impetus began, and the concept was to provide a deterrent to littering and trashing in the Delta, and we immediately learned that that wasn't very feasible. And then it became, well, let's clean up the Delta by removing trash, and we also learned that that wasn't very feasible as well. So instead, we went out and next slide, please. We went out and collected trash ourselves, and our goal was to be able to provide a recipe and a template to other folks, and some motivation for other folks to appreciate the Delta, have pride in it, and conduct cleanups in the same way that we had. Next slide, please. And the way we wanted to do that was by modeling behavior. And so we wanted to go out and actually clean up ourselves and put the gloves on and get dirty and learn exactly what it took to do that efficiently. And what we learned is you need certain tools. You have to have preparations. There's a certain amount of funding that goes into it. But what we wanted to do was share in the glory. And that was probably the best part about the whole project was we went out and we cleaned up this trash. And although it wasn't, extremely enjoyable at times, it felt great afterwards. It really felt like we had contributed to something great, and we weren't just merely on the earth occupying space, we were actually working towards a common goal, and it felt wonderful. So that's something that we want to share with people and hopefully prop them up and get them doing the same thing that we did. So our goal again was to create a simple recipe for others and put some energy into the butterfly effect. Next slide, please. So we went out on a couple different occasions, and we gathered up some other folks that wanted to join us, and we filled the trucks up, and we collected as much trash as we could. There's trash all over the Delta, as you all know. Most of us are Delta residents, pretty familiar with the area. It's really hard to choose where. So prior to doing that, we had to acquire all the proper tools, gloves, bags, pickup sticks. And then we wanted to choose areas that had high recreational users. And what we would do is there'd be a whole bank full of fishermen. We'd go out and get really close to them. We'd engage with them. We'd pick up trash around them. And before you know it, we were supplying energy into that butterfly effect, and it was really cool. They would start to pick up trash. And people would stop, and they would pick up trash. And before you know it, as we're driving around picking up the piles that we collected, there was another pile that someone else had collected. So we were seeing it in effect right away. The image on the bottom right is of a field that we spent some time picking up trash. And we spent hours there, and there's just a never-ending amount. You walk a few feet, and then you see more, and it's really difficult to stop, but we all have, other responsibilities. But once we did that, and we cleaned this area, it had been witnessed by a farmer, and he went out and mowed this entire area that we had just cleaned. So that was another reward of sorts, and we were slowly pitching in. Next slide, please. So essentially, what we wanted to do was, instead of trying to do it all ourselves, pick up all the trash ourselves, or stop people from littering, which I think is a valid goal, and we can all contribute to that, we wanted to provide a recipe and some motivation and inspiration for groups to go out and do the same thing that we did. And we created a website, which we have it all prepared, ready to go live with it. We don't want to entirely be on the hook for the funding, but I suppose no good deed goes unpunished, right? So we've provided a template for groups, and in particular following a model of outlining ways that groups can community organize. That was the main goal, and that includes a shopping list, local resources, and agencies that participate and help groups dispose of trash. There's very few, so that was kind of disappointing. But there are safety precautions. We outlined those a little bit, biohazards people don't want to interact with. Reporting instructions, there is a program out there, Sacramento County 311. If there's trash that's too heavy for you to lift, then they can come out and pick that up for you. So that's essentially what we did. Instead of doing it all ourselves, we want to enlist you guys, we want to enlist the community, and that essentially is our product for this course. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Any questions?
Any questions for Chris?
Yes, I just want to commend you for, going out and taking care of trash. This kind of reminds me of Caltrans Adopt a Highway program, where people can adopt a certain section of highway, and they go out, a couple times a month and pick up the trash. And, it's a huge issue on the highways, finding litter, and you just can't keep up with it. And just want to commend you for coming up with a structure that allows people to, take some ownership and actually try to do something positive. So thank you.
Thank you.
And actually, that's a great segue, Commissioner Flournoy. I should let commission members know that the commission has adopted a stretch of highway. It's on Highway 12, but we're in the process of adopting a stretch of Interstate 5 in the interior Delta. We don't have commission staff nor community groups go out and pick up the trash. We work with the contractors, but my goal is to get that transferred over to community groups, and maybe what we provide in support for the contractors can help fund a community organization in the Delta to do that work. But look for our sign on I-5 here shortly.
Thank you.
So I just want to, right up my alley what you are doing. I ran Friends of Marsh Creek for 10 years previous to being in elected office. And what I found every year when we did creek cleanups, we did the Sherman Island cleanup one year, is that every person that participates, while they're doing that, they are thinking about what they've done to contribute to that, whether it's not closing the garbage dumpster and having it blow down into your storm drains, whether it's, just not being responsible. So you're giving people an opportunity to do something, and that little bit, when everybody does it together, creates a very substantial pile. They think about how they can prevent that from happening in the future. And they do say that 70% of the garbage found out in the ocean comes from inland sources. So the things that you're doing is not only cleaning up our area, but it's helping contribute to removing some of the pollution that's going out into the ocean. It's contagious, and it's very exciting, and I really appreciate you doing that.
Thank you.
Any other, Chuck?
I think it's a great program. It's interesting because, California is rated the trashiest state in the United States. Nevada's number 2. And one of the things that I'm sure others here have noticed when we travel, especially back on the East Coast or in the Midwest or whatever, if you drive, for example, in the state of Ohio, if you drive on the freeways, it looks like a park, literally. And I guess one of the problems that we have in our county, San Joaquin County, is we usually spend about $600,000 a year on picking up trash cleanup, et cetera, dumping. Last year we spent over $1.3 million. It is increasing. What you're doing is really the impetus for a lot of programs like Diane talks about, because we all deal with these homeless encampments, which are devastating, and talk about a biohazard. And then on top of that, and I think the one thing that Diane talked about, and I think what you've done is we need to really change the culture of this state so people really take ownership and understand that when they throw that, McDonald's wrapper out the window or whatever they throw, that it's their state, and they should take pride in that. And so whether it be abandoned boats in the Delta or whether it be, homeless encampments or what you're doing, I think is a key element to what we should be doing, throughout the Delta and certainly throughout this state. So great project. Thank you.
Comments, Chuck? Anybody else? See, now, Chris, thank you again.
Yep. Thank you all.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris. Our second class project will be presented by Julian Ergalet, and their project involved a proposed Delta license plate. Julian. And Julian is a Knightson resident, Contra Costa County, a vintner and viticulturalist with a family farming and wine operation, and is also treasurer of First Generation Farmers of Discovery Bay.
I want to join Chris in saying thank you very much for having us here tonight and listening to other voices of the Delta, and thank you very much, Erik, for hosting us through this session. So I want to get right into it. The other members of the group unfortunately couldn't make it due to illness or midterm exams in law school. We came from a perspective of branding and then narrowed down on license plate. I'm not native to the Delta, and the concept of the Delta for us was tricky to grasp. So many different images float around in my mind when prospecting that, and we shared that approach. So for everyone in this room, the Delta is a clear and physical concept, but how does it transpire out of this room and out of this road and down I-5 and across the Sierras? Because the impact of water and the impact of waste and the impact of environment is not local. It's an open system, so how can the Delta, the idea of the Delta, be approached from an open system? So if we can go to the next slide, please. So the idea is the starting point is promoting a sustainable awareness. So not a spike in awareness, but progressive growth in awareness for the Delta, and empowering a sense of ownership for Delta issues. So not specific, but general, which is the essence of branding. And with all of that, contributing to coordinated branding of the Delta. There's a lot of individual efforts, but the more simple the approach, the easier the common denomination and the easier the message. If we could go to the next slide. So one of these concepts of a very broad field is something that everyone uses every day. A bumper sticker has a similar message. Anyone that commutes in traffic sees these and is inspired for a brief moment in thought, mentions it on a phone conversation, or takes it home in thought. License plates, special interest license plates. Very simple, can be pretty effective. For us, the strength of this would be the delegating and sharing ownership. By having something that I need on a daily basis and put onto my vehicle that I use, I'm taking over a sense of ownership, and I'm contributing to a multiplying effect. So I'm spreading this with a contact point of, if I commute down 680 or 80, 10, 15,000 people a day potentially. It's a trigger of conversation. I can take over pride, and I can say, this is why I have this license plate. And it's a unifying element. Honk if you have a Delta license plate. If that happens down in San Diego, that could be a start of a romance or a conversation. Next slide, please. So the impact is significant. I can't read the numbers off this slide, but it's definitely 5-digit and into 6-digit. And if we know the cost of a license plate, so these are listed license plates and their impacts just for scale. So the top one is the environmental license plates that were established in the 70s. So 41,000 plates issued in the calendar year this graph was made at $50 a license plate, and the equal numbers below, it's significant scale that then can be distributed in portion to efforts to kind of further that, further emission specific to the Delta or to any other environmental impact chosen. Next slide, please. The limitations, of course, are cash. So the threshold would be that once a design and once an idea is approved and signed off by the DMV, there would need to be a letter of intent followed by 7,500 prepaid applications. And once those prepaid applications were received, this could go forward. So we're talking about roughly $400,000 to get this ball rolling. If you could skip to the next slide, please. So obviously funding is the biggest challenge. And again, in funding, the source of funding is group dynamic. We deal a lot in nonprofit fundraising and branding and marketing of luxury products. I make wine, so it's about selling a product. And again, how would we do this in this case? I think our advice would be to generate a commitment in group engagement. There's a big network of stores, media, schools, radios, chain, local organizations that could contribute to this and provide license plates for their staff, encourage their members, encourage their contributors. What we started doing, maybe going a step outside, was we started asking local high school students affiliated with our organization to contribute artwork. So collaborative branding, getting parents involved, maybe even having a form of competition, North Delta, South Delta, Contra Costa. So having students and having the community come up with potential label designs, because ultimately it is one picture, and the picture is not a bird or a glass of water, it is Delta. So how can everyone be part of that? For scale, company fleet commitments in Northern and Southern California to bridge that border down, prominent endorsements. If Steve Curry could have a license plate with the Delta, that would be great help. Voluntary discount models. Everyone is looking for a benefit out of the input in a system like that. So if I go through Fast Track and pay $4 instead of $5 because of a Delta license plate, then that could maybe encourage someone whose threshold was not reached to pass that threshold and share that story and encourage his environment to move ahead with the same. So many thoughts. It's a broad project. We had little contact time, but we thought the branding minced onto the license plate had a massive potential. If you could conclude with the last two slides. These are two suggestions drawn by the high school student that was very motivated to support us with that. I think more time would have generated more proposals. So the endangered species in the Delta, there would be an endless list of. This is two designs that we had in the last month and a half. Many more could follow, but again, just finding one unifying factor and not thinking about the bird and not thinking about the face or the color, but everyone knowing that this is Delta. And then how could that be a unifying element carried north, south, east, and west? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Julian. I believe you probably have a question. No? Any questions for Julian? Very good, thank you.
Thank you.
We appreciate it. You have to go to the microphone.
The microphone, please, Monty.
I have a loud enough voice.
No,
No, you
we're
don't.
recording this. We want you to be heard.
It's just about Julian, because his wife may not be here. He's going to be a new daddy.
Yay,
And he and his wife were both in the leadership program. And I didn't know whether you were going to make it tonight. So, the
Don't worry about him, it's his wife you gotta worry about.
I just had to bring out the family part of it.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you, Monty. I won't try to summarize that for the record. But I will now ask James Johas. Is that right, James? You're presenting for the third group, and this group worked on a project involving Delta curriculum.
Hi, everyone. Like Erik said, my name is James Johas, and I want to thank you all for being here as well. My group did the Delta Curriculum Survey, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But the group was made up of Topher Chan, myself, James Pfluger, Amelia Raquel, and Jamie Reamer. So initially what we wanted to do was get awareness of the Delta out. We're all aware of it here. We all work in it. We all live in it. But it seems like there's a disconnect the further out you go. For example, I live in Clarksburg, and I've been told by many people, even in the pocket in Greenhaven, well, I didn't know this was out here. And, this is a beautiful area. How do we not know about this? So we thought, well, maybe if we can get people aware of it at a young age, say school, 4th grade maybe, when they teach California history, it would be a good way to introduce them to the area. Throughout the state, there's economic significance, cultural significance, ecological significance. It's a plethora of information out there for the whole state, and it's very important. So we wanted to create a curriculum, but realized that was not going to happen. Just too much involved in order to get it approved, make sure it met all the standards. Just to get it into the classroom was going to be just a nightmare. So Erik tipped us off to a meeting where Frank Pesey, the director of social science at Scowey, Sac County Office of Education, was there, and we found out that he already had a curriculum that was ready to go, pretty much exactly what we'd been looking for. So next slide. So we met with Frank as a group and said, hey, what can we do to help you promote this? Because we think this is a great idea, and we want to do anything we can to promote it. And he thought an awareness campaign, going out and speaking to teachers, telling them about it, making them aware that this resource was available would be really helpful. Or to survey the teachers to find out if they're already teaching about the Delta, what they know about the Delta, how they're teaching about it. We realized that the campaign was great, but it would just not work for us. We wouldn't be able to get a good campaign done in time, do something on YouTube so a teacher can click on a video, see what's out there. We didn't have the resources to do it, but the survey seemed like a really good fit. We'd be able to get some questions and get some metrics on, how far out from the Delta are people aware of it? What do they know about it? And basically we can collect all this data, give it to Frank. It would help him get a baseline of, okay, this is what my program has. What do I need to gear it towards? What am I missing? How can I help? It'd be good for us because we'd be able to find out as well the same things. Is everybody aware of the Delta? And what do they know? So next slide. And this is more of what was talking about, just if we can get Delta to be a topic in these classrooms, it gets kids involved at a young age. They become more aware of it and what's going on with it. If teachers are teaching about it, great. Why? And what's working for you and why not? What do we need to help you improve that? It would also help us launch the curriculum, again, because Frank could fine it down, refine it, get it where it needs to be. And it would also get us set a baseline of, okay, we got the program out there. Now let's do another survey to follow up to see, has it been adopted? And is it working? And is it actually creating more awareness? Next slide. So we sent the test out, and the results were not great. It opened on April 9th, and we closed on April 27th, and we only had 4 people respond. So we're not really sure where we went wrong, which is what I'll get into in a little bit later. Either the teachers were too busy, there's statewide testing then, so that might not have been a great time. Maybe it was presented in a way that didn't involve them or get them interested in actually taking the survey, or they didn't know about the Delta in the first place and they felt intimidated by finding out what they didn't know. So the survey was fairly simple. It was only about 14 questions, and this is it right here. But we didn't catch their attention. So next slide. But we did learn a lot of lessons, and this is probably pretty important. What we could have maybe incentivized better. We gave out Amazon gift cards. Maybe that wasn't the right gift. Maybe we should have looked at the timing better, but really what it boiled down to, we didn't host the survey, so we really don't know what happened. If we'd hosted the survey, we would have seen initially, hey, we're not getting the respondents we want. We're not getting the involvement we want. Okay, let's take it off. Let's refine it. Let's get it back out there. Let's relaunch it. And so since we didn't have that access to that information, we couldn't really refine it and get it back out there again in a time frame to present here. So next. So we do recommend doing the survey again. The curriculum's great. It's a really great curriculum, and finding out where we're, basically where we went wrong as far as maybe it was a distribution channel, that could be a project for another class. They could find out maybe, okay, we don't want to send it out like an email like this. Maybe it needs to come from a certain person. That way it doesn't just look like spam. Maybe there's a lot of different things that we could tweak and maybe be more persistent in going out there and sending out more emails instead of just the one. But the other option is maybe get teachers' attention in a different way, hosting them out, taking them out to like the wildlife refuge, and getting them involved, getting them a more sense of awareness or inclusion to the Delta, and that would get them more likely to adopt the curriculum. So that's where we ended up.
Any comments or questions? Ron?
Yeah, I'm kind of curious. What was your logic for targeting 4th grade teachers?
Initially, the curriculum could go out to anyone, but we thought 4th grade because that's California history, where you typically do the mission projects or you're doing more California curriculum. And we thought it fit in really well because there's a lot of cultural history out here, you know, the town of Locke, the different communities that are out here. There's ecology of the area, Staten Island, and the wildlife refuge, and the economics of it. So it incorporates not just the water, it's everything that, you know, is great about the state is right here. And it affects almost everyone throughout the state. So that's why we kind of targeted that demographic.
Did you consider maybe doing the survey electronically as well? Do you think that would have been more successful?
So maybe I should have mentioned that. It was an electronic survey, and it did go out through digital channels. And that's why we thought it'd be great because we could get the feedback almost in real time. That we could see, okay, how many people were replying. We didn't have access to that. I think Frank hosted the survey, and so he had access to that information. And so that's where we had a little bit of a disconnect. So we're thinking that if the next group would like to participate, maybe they host it, and they can get data, okay, wait, you know, this isn't working, something's wrong. We need to email it in a different way or present it in a different way.
Okay, great, thank you.
Any other questions? Chuck.
I appreciate the effort. I think it's a great idea. I'll be honest with you, though, having taught, I think, one, there's too many questions. Two, there's too many options to figure out. I think if you boil it down to 4 or 5 questions, some of the basic ones you ask in more meatier in the survey, I think there'd have been more of a tendency to answer it because I'm just looking at it and I know something about the Delta, but I have to sit there and ponder which one am I going to answer. If you give them 4, you know, and 1 or 2 they can throw away, that makes it a lot easier to fill it out. So I think it's a great idea, but I would condense it down and shorten it up.
No, thank you. It's a great suggestion. We thought about that too. Yeah, maybe it was just too long. And we could have just said, take this 5-minute survey. It's 4 questions. We asked a bunch of questions about where they were from, and maybe we could have gotten rid of all that and just focused on, okay, what do you know? And so could have taken that away from it too.
Yeah, just a question though, so you had 4 respondents, so it was easy to tally. What did they tell you?
So we didn't even bother to look at the data. 3 of them were basically blank. And so we only really got 1 respondent. So we're like, you know what, we don't even want to look at this data because it's just going to be 1 person. And that's not a great pool to pull from, so.
So you had 3 out of the 4 were blank.
Yeah, 3 out of the 4, they just kind of just opened the survey and started doing it, put their information in, and because, like I say, we had 4 Amazon gift cards, and all 4 of them won. So
Well, they shouldn't have won if they didn't complete the survey. So.
Yeah. So, oh well.
Any other questions? Erik?
No, just want to thank James for that presentation.
All right, James, thank you.
And Mr. Chair, would you be willing to join Monty Van Camp Condos? We have 7 members of our group here this evening. If you would mind joining them in a brief presentation of certificates. These are legislative certificates of commendation. This was spearheaded by our ex officio member, Senator Galgiani's office, but it includes Senator Bill Dodd, Assemblyman Jim Frazier, and Assembly Member Susan Talamantes-Eggman, who's also our ex officio member. Anyway, they prepared these. We'll ask you all to present. And as you're doing it, I'll give and I have asked Stacy to, I'm going to pronounce the name. And the first is Chris Vallée, and I'm not going to be in the picture. Chris, we want you to in between these 2 people. And again, what I didn't say about Chris is that he's a resident of Sherman Island, so. Yes. Great. Thanks, Chris.
Good job, Chris.
Our next presentation is to Brian Bush. And Brian is a Dixon resident. He's the general manager of Reclamation District 2068 in Solano County. And next is Julian Ergele. And I've introduced him before, but just a reminder, he is a Knightson resident in Contra Costa County. And as you didn't hear Monty say from the audience because she did not have a microphone, soon to be a father. First-time father. Photo, Monty.
Picture first.
And then again, let me reintroduce James Johas. And I did not properly introduce James. He's a Clarksburg resident. He's a Reclamation District trustee and is on the board of the Clarksburg Wine Growers and Vintners Association. And now Christopher Chan, who goes by Topher. Topher's a Cortland resident, so he probably got to walk over here from his home. Could have. And he's a 4th-generation Delta farmer, a board member of the California Pear Advisory Board, and he's also the captain of the Cortland Volunteer Fire Department. And James Pfluger. James is an Antioch resident. He's the harbor master at the Antioch Marina. And then finally, let me introduce Amelia Raquel. Amelia is the Conservation Program Manager with the Nature Conservancy on Staten Island, and she's also a trustee of 2 reclamation districts, Staten Island and McCormick-Williamson Tract. Congratulations. And again, thank you to our members of the legislature who collaborated together to provide the certificates of commendation. And we have additional members of the class. I won't introduce them. I ask you to take a look at the report in the meeting packet, but we will be providing the commendations to them. So all in all, a great third group of Delta Leadership Program participants.
Very good. We're moving on to item 9, the Delta Flood Risk Management Assessment District Feasibility Study and Delta Levee Financing Options Report. What a mouthful.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And with this, I'm going to introduce Richard McCann. Members of the commission probably know Richard from presentations he's made previously. He's a principal with the M.Cubed firm. They were the lead consultant on what we initially called the Delta Flood Risk Management Assessment District Feasibility Study. And when we determined that a Delta-wide assessment district was not feasible, we kind of altered our wording a little bit. Tonight, what you have before you is a final copy of the report. It looks like this. There are a few copies of it on the table, the check-in table for members of the audience. Richard's going to briefly walk through the provisions of this report, and then I'll follow up with some additional commentary on the work that our commission subcommittee did, and then the specific action that is before you this evening.
Yes, good evening, Commissioners. I'm happy to see you. I see there's a few new faces. I'm going to basically walk through a first summary of what we did in the report and the context so that you some of you who are not as familiar will be reminded of what we have done, and then talk a little bit about the findings that we had from our report. So next slide, please. So the context of this report was that there was a RFP issued in 2014 that we responded to, and then this process took a couple of years to work through. Initially, we were looking at a question of the funding for Delta levees is in flux for a number of reasons, that the Delta Plan and the Economic Sustainability Plan had called for the formation of an assessment district, a Delta-wide assessment district, and that was the context for doing this report. The California Water Action Plan had called for increased flood protection as well, so that we were looking for ways of financing that. And finally, there was a long-standing interest in the question of, can you create a financing system that is based on the beneficiaries pay principle, which is beneficiaries of a service pay for the service in proportion to those benefits. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get farther into the slides. So next slide. This process had fairly significant stakeholder involvement throughout it. We had initial outreach to stakeholders, some short meetings, phone calls. We set up 4 workshops that we worked through. Then after the issuance of the draft report in late 2016, we actually had a couple more meetings in 2017 with stakeholders, and stakeholders actually provided more edits to the report as well. And we finally got through to the point that the subcommittee looked at the report in April and moved it on to the commission. Next slide. Our study objectives was to establish an evaluation process that was fairly structured. It's described in detail in the report itself. We were identifying potential financing mechanisms, so we created a whole list of mechanisms, actually about 50 different types of ways of raising funds associated with the Delta that we looked at. And then we evaluated the feasibility of those mechanisms, both in legal and economic terms and across a range of circumstances. So that we were looking, for example, we were using what we called archetypes, where we looked at islands that fit particular kinds of patterns, urban islands, rural islands, or islands in different places in the delta. Next slide, please. So the first question we looked at was, what are the benefits of the delta levees? And I think many of you are aware of many of those, but we wanted to really articulate what those benefits were in a very structured way. Along with flood protection, there's also conveyance of fresh water across the delta, provision of ecosystem and habitat, and then just the unique values of the delta that many people talk about, the cultural, recreational, and tourism benefits that individuals realize from the delta. So next slide. And then there's a list of who benefits from the delta and what kind of benefits that they derive. And I'm not going to go through this list, but it's delineated in more detail in the report. There's quite a discussion about this in the report. And these are the groups that we will be targeting the financing mechanisms at. So next slide. So our first set of findings is about the settings in the delta, and then there's the next set is about what type of mechanisms we found that were feasible. One of the first findings is that many of the benefits of the delta extend to groups and individuals outside of the delta. So, for example, water exporters in Southern California benefit from the delta. That's just one of the more obvious ones. But expanding the benefits beyond the delta doesn't mean that they shouldn't be paying for those levees if the levees were originally constructed by the individuals who live in the delta. That is that those groups should be paying in proportion to the benefits that they derive from the levees, not just relying on what was previous investments. And there's just a short example of some of these beneficiaries who don't really pay in proportion to their benefits for flood protection and provision of the levees. And then finally, our last finding, which was the one that led to the conclusion that a delta-wide assessment district really wasn't going to add anything to this, is that the property-based assessment process, which is used by reclamation districts, really doesn't capture all the beneficiaries because, for example, the water exporters don't own much property within the delta, and they don't own it in proportion to the benefits that they derive from the delta. So you have to look for other types of financing mechanisms if you're going to develop this kind of system. So next slide. So what we looked at is if you were going to have this kind of system, how would you work through that process in order to set up the types of financing mechanisms that you wanted to set up? And you would start by basically estimating what your expected costs are for maintaining and investing and improving in the system. Look at the benefits that are derived and attach those to particular beneficiaries. And then you would be basically allocating the benefits across this pie chart. The slices are not at all in proportion to the benefits, but it does tell you the types of beneficiaries that we would expect to see. And then what you find is that there are two kinds of benefits. There are benefits that accrue to private individuals or to private groups that you can separate out. For example, a water charge, you can separate out a water charge on a per acre foot basis. And then there are another set of public beneficiaries for whom you can't really separate out individual charges. So ecosystem benefits are enjoyed by the state as a whole, and there aren't benefits for any separable benefits for any one individual. So you have to have different kinds of financing mechanisms, and we discussed that in our report, and it can be seen on the chart that you would do public benefits would be paid through state and federal financing, and private benefits could be charged through other types of financing mechanisms, which we discuss more. So next slide. And so what we looked at was the feasibility of the portfolio of mechanisms that we were looking at. So you want to look at what are the constraints that exist in current law. Would it raise sufficient funds? Is it administratively feasible? And is it feasible in terms of getting it through politically? Are there other examples of other types of mechanisms of those kinds that have been done in the past? So next slide. So we culled a list of feasible mechanisms from about a list of 50 that we started with, and there's about 7 that we culled down to. The first one is, of course, the existing reclamation districts. That is, that we would suggest that that's likely one of the financing mechanisms that would continue into the future. That's not a surprise. The second one that we identified was a delta flood protection fee, which would be levied on infrastructure and existing structures in the delta, including, for example, on pumps and that sort of thing. That particular fee, it would be structured on something like the statewide rural fire protection fee, but that fee, that particular fee was also rescinded in the last budget. So it's not clear how, whether that one would continue to be implemented. We also looked at user fees, particularly tied to water use. And it would be one of these 3 fee structures would be the type that would be imposed in this type of structure. The first one would be a general delta-wide water user fee. What's interesting about this is by far most of the water that's used from the delta is actually exported outside of the delta. So that fee would fall substantially on users outside the delta. The second one would be a water conveyance fee on water exporters that might be perhaps imposed by the State Water Board or by DWR itself. The third was actually a conveyance lease fee, in which case the State Lands Commission, who owns the channel bottoms of the delta, would actually lease space on the channel bottoms to water exporters, and that they would pay a lease fee. So the State Lands Commission already actually leases bottom land to water dischargers from, for example, power plants. So there is precedent for this kind of fee in the future. So those are the kinds of user fees that we looked at. And then we also looked at public benefit financing methods, which is, and again, these already exist. It's more of a question of determining what are the relative state benefits and federal benefits that accrue from the activities and the resources that are provided in the delta as they accrue to the state. So there's the general fund, general and revenue bonds, and then finally federal financing. And so each one of those would be rebalanced relative to the benefits if you were developing a benefits-based portfolio. So next slide, please. And so our final findings going forward were that we looked at a number of these financing mechanisms, but they still have, this was a feasibility assessment, not a recommendation or an implementation study. There's still a number of issues that would have to be addressed in any one of these financing mechanisms, including exploring more of the technical and legal issues that affect the ability to collect the revenues, and also just the practice of determining the benefits and the beneficiaries in greater detail than we did in this study. There would also need to be more stakeholder engagement in that and negotiation in that process in order to end up with a final portfolio of these sorts of fees. But one of the things is that right now there actually is a forum where they are looking at financing mechanisms in conclusion to the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan that was issued in December 2017, which actually came substantially after the completion of the first draft of this report. And that is one place in which this kind of engagement might occur. We are basically suggesting that this report be just presented to them as a list of potential financing mechanisms if they're interested in exploring this sort of thing. And with that, I think that's the end of my summary of this report.
Richard, thank you as one of the members of the subcommittee, and I'd like to identify the subcommittee members because we put in a lot of work. It was Justin Van Lobensel's, Kate White, who was then replaced by Marlon. They threw him in right at the end to vote on this thing. Then we had Chris Trinnell and myself, and I want to tell you that we worked hard at it, and It wasn't easy to start with, but I think we've come up with a product that everybody can get behind. But I'd like to have the public comment first, and then we'll bring it back for the board to discuss it. So I have only one card. If you want to speak on this item, please fill out a card and bring it up. Melinda, you're up.
Good evening, Melinda Terry with the California Central Valley Flood Control Association. And I think it was last October when I got up and spoke on this item, and I basically begged you to please not pass it that night. Because once I'd really read the full draft, I was surprised of how the fees turned out, because how they'd been described sounded like it was on other beneficiaries who were not currently paying. And as you saw, even the Delta user fee, water user fee would imply, while most of the water is that's exported, there's 1 million acre feet that's diverted in the Delta. So that's an example. It could apply to those that are in the Delta on top of the property assessment that they may be paying for levies. But I was really appreciative because the commission did decide to, take it back to the subcommittee. Very appreciative of both the consultants and Erik and the patience of everyone on the committee to really work with us. I met, a couple times with the farm bureaus, and we talked about it. I talked about it with my members at the reclamation districts, and we did our best to really also just make improvements in terms of corrections and for factual information. So I can't get up here and say that we're in support, of the document and what it is proposing in terms of the feasibility of fees, but we absolutely can say that, I think we got to a point where it's a product that you can, deliver to the department. I think the question just really to ask yourselves, and I've talked about with our one representative on the commission, is, whether you I would just caution you, because I've worked my 30-something years in politics, and it is a report. It ends up on a shelf. It's on the internet, as we know. Whether it's legislative staff 6 months from now or 6 years from now, to them it will just be a DPC report. So the question you have to ask yourselves is, how you want it to be portrayed in terms of whether those are fees that you're endorsing them in terms of feasibility, or whether you want to create some distance. It is a consultant report, not the commission's report, and I will just leave it at that. But I do appreciate all the work, and we did get to a point where we felt comfortable having it come forward for you to take a look at and consider. Thanks.
And I think Melinda needs to be recognized for the hard work that she put into making this something that maybe you can't support, but it's about a compromise as we move forward. And it was suggested that there be a transmittal letter. If you look at the first page of the report, some members felt very strongly it should be included in the report itself. So you didn't pick up the report and read it without knowing that even though it is a consultant report, we've hopefully will approve it this evening. We have some reservations, let me put it that way. Anyone else from the public wishing to comment? Okay, back to the commission. Any comments? Justin.
Thanks, Skip. Yeah, so I was on the subcommittee, and I share Melinda's concerns, being the representative for the North Delta water agencies. It's a little frightening when those of us that are paying the lion's share for levee maintenance that we have a report here that's suggesting we could potentially pay something even more. So that is a concern. However, I do understand that in order to maintain our credibility with DWR, we do need to submit something. I think there may be some silver lining to that it will, at a very minimum, hopefully keep the DPC at the table for these discussions in the future, and I think that's extremely important. So although I'm not supportive of the report content, I am supportive of submitting it to DWR with the transmittal letter as written. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. Don?
Just to that point then, so is it the qualifying portion of this is the last paragraph where basically, to just echo what Justin just said, that the commission would be approving delivery of this study to Department of Water Resources in accordance with the provisions of the agreement, interagency, but that the commissioners would not and have not endorsed any of the proposed fee mechanisms, conclusions, or recommendations developed by the consultant team. And I guess my question is, would it be appropriate to bold that in the transmittal letter so that it is very clear that, to Melinda's point, again, not to change the content, but to make sure that it gets called out. There are a couple of other bolded items here, and I'm just, again, that way, if it gets stuck on somebody's shelf, they pull it off and they begin to examine it. That's very clear at the time we transmitted this. Again, not to change the content. So I would just suggest that we might want to bold that last paragraph to be very clear about it. Assuming we take action this evening.
Erik, I don't see any problem. Do you?
No,
I think it's a
absolutely.
good suggestion.
In fact, the staff recommendation is for the commission to adopt the report and to direct any changes you would like to make to that report, or at least authorize your executive director to correct any errata, or, we're going to certainly find some typographical errors and page errors when we go through this. I'd like the authority to make those non-substantive changes. But certainly anything along the lines of what Commissioner Natoli just suggested, that's fair game for the final motion tonight.
Okay. Skip, if I could, I just want to express my thanks to the subcommittee and to all those that worked on it, because I recall not just last October, but a time in West Sacramento when we were hearing this probably a couple of years ago, and I think that there was some, and I know that Richard and the consultant team, certainly took some comments from this commissioner as it related to some of the early work, and again, I think that the seriousness by which this commission, its members, and certainly our staff and those that consulted us took this up and put the hard effort in that I think is reflected here. So I just want to express my thanks to you as chair, to your fellow committee members, those that are present and those that aren't, and certainly to all that contributed to that, because I think you have a much better product here at the end of the day. Thanks.
If I can just follow up on those comments. This was a commission report, but it really had a lot of public input. And that's why I think it made it so much better. Maybe not what we wanted, right, Melinda? But it's a lot better than when we started. And I think that should be it was a contribution by the public with the author, M.Cubed. They were willing to listen to the public, yourself. I think we came out with a much better project. Anyway.
Yeah, just a thought. I mean, I think oftentimes these reports, there's a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of money spent on them. And many of us who are sitting here today probably aren't going to be here 3-4 years down the road when the landscape may very well change. And I wondered if we might not, in light of the time, energy, money spent, that we put it maybe on a standing agenda at least once a year to kind of bring it back, check it, even on a consent item to say, has the landscape changed? Is there a need to maybe dust it off and recommend it or remind EWR of its existence? Not ad nauseum, but just as a reminder for a couple of years, maybe extend its shelf life, because it's a shame there's a tremendous amount of good information in here, and maybe and with all the qualifiers I think are appropriate that have been shared in terms of the concerns and the reservations, but I think it's a document that's certainly worthy of extending its shelf life beyond simply a motion tonight and then it gets sort of buried. I don't know. I mean, that's just one way to kind of extend its shelf life, I guess.
No, I think that makes total sense, Vice Chair Villegas. And, it could even be folded into an annual report on levee-related issues. I mean, this is something this commission is keenly interested in, the entire topic of Delta levees, and whether it's funding for Delta levees or prioritization of levee improvements, or now how we fund levee improvements in the future. I would be very much in favor of making that a regular report item, and this follow-up on this could be part of that reporting.
Yes, George.
Central Delta is my colleague down there from North Delta. I agree. I wouldn't support this. One of the issues I have is that North Delta, Central Delta, South Delta pays within the district pays assessments for the levees. The districts themselves, which I'm president of two, 548 and 2085, pay assessments for levees, and we also participate in government-funded programs, state-funded programs at 2575, which that may be under scrutiny at this point. And then if we have to participate in some kind of a tax or a fee on top of that, that's really not fair when some people are not paying anything and are getting just the amount of benefit that I am to assess me. I think a simple way would do that is be able to maybe somehow give us, recognize what we are putting into our levies ourselves versus the guy that comes from, I don't know, Pittsburgh and Antioch and drives around the levee and enjoys the delta. And although he pays his taxes, goes to the state funds and this and that, not paying what we're paying. And so that's the objection I would have at this point. And along with North Delta, I would submit this somewhat with a asterisk, or if there's such a thing. That's where Central Delta lies right now.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Commissioner Biaggi, and certainly that was the intention of the transmittal statement, which was looked at by the subcommittee on several occasions and actually was even modified earlier this month when the subcommittee last met. And the request was very clear to put that in a prominent place within the report so no one would miss it when they take a look at this, if it were to be finalized by the commission tonight. And I think we have a good transmittal statement that really lays out all of those qualifications and even the disclaimer at the very end that Commissioner Natoli suggested being bolded, which basically says we're delivering this report to Department of Water Resources in fulfillment of our interagency agreement. It doesn't necessarily mean that we endorse all of the findings of this report or the specific mechanisms identified.
Well, thank you for that.
Thank you, Chairman. I was actually able to participate on the subcommittee at several of its meetings. My take is that I'm very comfortable with the report. It has no silver bullets, if you will, but it seems to me that it's exhaustively researched, and I would support Supervisor Villegas's desire to make sure that it's something that we're able to, keep fresh. So I appreciate that.
Any other comments?
Now, I know that as the Delta Protection Commission, I'm a little naive as to all the knowledge that all the people sitting up here and possibly in the room have, but I'm thinking if, we don't prevail on the tunnels, and they do, or the single tunnel, or whatever it's called today, wouldn't we want to assess all of Southern California too, if they were benefiting from our water? And then I think that was the first thing I thought of was Met and their islands that they purchased. We could take the rats out there to those islands for them. Shame on me. I said it was naive. I don't know. I'm just thinking that, it seems like a lot of people benefit from our water. And we are assessed and taxed, and, we would need to include all the benefactors if something horrible would happen like that.
Yeah, certainly as Richard McCann stated, there are multiple beneficiaries of Delta levies, and the current system we have basically receives funding from one group of beneficiaries, which are Delta property interests, and then the state picks up the rest of the tab, and it's a significant tab that they pick up. But in essence, the state is really subsidizing other beneficiaries under the current system. That was certainly the rationale behind this idea being included within the Delta plan it was included within the Commission's economic sustainability plan, I think really more toward an eye of, hey, we're paying our part in the Delta, but others outside the Delta really need to be paying theirs. And so the thought behind it is pretty well understood and embraced by a lot of people. Of course, it gets really interesting when you get down to the brass tacks of how you actually determine the level of benefit, and then more interesting, how you figure out how to collect from those people that benefit. But the current system, and whether it gets the in-Delta contribution right, I mean, I think the general conclusion, as deeply as our consultant team got into it, is that it about captures the in-Delta benefit, the current assessments through reclamation districts. So that part is probably about right. Maybe it's a little less, maybe it's a little bit more in some cases. You couldn't really determine that until you go into great detail and evaluate. But certainly all those other big beneficiaries, and he listed an important handful, including not only water exporters, but also billions of dollars of infrastructure that is within the Delta and is protected by these levees. And the state's picking up that tab currently, which is appropriate if it were protecting state highways, and we'd have significant protection of state highways in the Delta. But if that protection is for a private railroad or a privately owned or quasi-privately owned utility corridor, then the state, in essence, is subsidizing that currently.
Well, I would say the first time this came before this commission, at least when I was here, I took a lot of heat from my constituents in regards to some of the perceptions on who would be paying, more than their fair share. What I see, and I appreciate Vice Chair Villegas's comment and certainly Supervisor Daly, is that I see this as a point of departure. It's something that is documented that we can build upon, and at least those who've contacted me will have an opportunity to look at this particular document and then make suggestions on how they would like to improve it. And as we talk about this in the future, we can make those modifications, but at least we have something to work from, with the caveat, obviously, that we're not endorsing it, but we are starting with it. And it does cover, I think it's a comprehensive study from the standpoint, it does cover all the possibilities on how, this can be funded. So I would agree. I would not want to endorse this or approve it, but I certainly would move it forward. And then, as Vice Chair Villegas says, revisit this periodically with additional information to improve upon it as we go forward.
Okay. One more thing. What will this do to the government programs we're having right now for the levees? Are they trying to get out of something? Not doing subvention, not doing, partial work, special projects, those kinds of things, because now you got all these people and you got these funds and we're out of here. Is that even possible? How does that work?
And I should have noted earlier in my executive director report, and this is kind of a work in progress, but it appears that at least the administration is proposing legislation to address the levy subvention sunset that is otherwise slated to occur on June 30th of this year. It's making its way through the legislative process. It's what they call trailer bill language, meaning it trails the adoption of the budget. And so I think, and it was really through the good work of the California Central Valley Flood Control Association engaging the administration, why we have that bill currently making its way through the legislative process. I think it's safe to say that will resolve this subvention problem we'll have otherwise, where the current 75%, 25% cost share expires on June 30th. So the legislation would continue that 75-25 cost share, would make some modest adjustments to the program. And I'm sorry, I think I lost my tail here in terms of where I started with this answer, but the transmittal statement has some very specific things to say about both the funding level for those levee programs, but also the cost share for the levee subvention program. The legislation that's currently making its way through the process is consistent with that. So I'm not sure that answered your initial question. I'm sorry, I kind of
I'm
got
just
off on a
worried about
tangent.
if they find another source, if the state finds another source, in your estimation, because you have a better grip on it than, obviously, than I do, is that going to, are they going to, you know, take one thing away and give us another?
I don't see, I think the grave concern out there is that you might partially implement these recommendations and only, I think the fear within the Delta landowner community is that the exporters are too politically powerful to go after, so you end up with some type of resolution to this where landowners in the Delta are paying more and others are not paying what they should or even anything. I don't really see that. I mean, that would be so transparently unfair and not in accordance with beneficiary pays. And I'm sure many of you are thinking this type of thing happens all the time. But I don't know. I'm really skeptical that that would be an outcome here. I think it's going to be terrifically difficult to get to a true beneficiary pays system because there are a lot of people that are getting the free ride now and they don't want that to end. But I don't see a partial implementation where it just is to the detriment of the Delta and everyone else is, unaffected by it. It just would seem so absolutely unfair to end up with that and just like bad policy to even do a partial solution like that that only dinged one party as opposed to anyone, the entire group.
What brings that to mind is how they shift the bond money around. I mean, you read some of those bonds and it says, to be used for specifically this, and the engineering amount to engineer this project is X and it's always Y. And so I'm very suspicious of this kind of thing saying, well, geez, you guys got all these guys paying now and we're going to go spend our money on, I don't know, whatever they spend money on.
Yeah.
So
Well,
if
certainly
you don't think that's an issue, then I'm satisfied with that. But I have a concern in past water bond issues where the money went, didn't go to dirt and gravel and stuff like that. It went studies and you don't have a real good record. I'm sorry to say that.
I appreciate that concern. This report is not ready for implementation. In fact, it very clearly states that it's not ready for implementation. There's a lot more work that needs to be done on identifying the level of benefit for starters. And of course, a lot more work to be done on further vetting of the proposed mechanisms. So I think there's enough protection in what we're asking the commission to approve and for us to transmit to DWR that we won't end up with that unintended outcome that you mentioned.
I'm sorry to hold everybody up, but it just...
No, I think it's good discussion.
Any other comments or questions? Pleasure of the board. Commissioner.
Well, Mr. Chair, I think actually the conversation's been helpful, and in the potential path forward, in the report itself, it says it's not recommended that this be adopted at this time, that further consideration and further evaluation, that this simply be used as a future, framework for further analysis and further deliberation. And I think those qualifiers, frankly, play to our favor, that we keep this on the radar in the event that the landscape changes, which in all probability, Susan mentioned, it could, in which case, we'd want to then put further qualifications and have more discussion, or certainly not tie the hands of future boards who want to say, those recommendations, we now want to caveat those recommendations even further, in whatever direction. And so I think it just, right or wrong, I think it just keeps it alive for those of us who want to, as you said, send nutria south, or whatever your recommendation was going to be. I think that's something that, that it would preserve the right, at least in the motion that I would offer in adopting this, that we include that as part of an ongoing annual check-in with the board on its status.
So that is a motion?
That's a motion.
Motion? There's a second?
So for our benefit, because we did have a specific wording in the staff recommendation, I meant to bring that to the commission's attention. I just want to make sure we're capturing the motion before us.
You want me
So,
to read the staff recommendation then?
well, if it's the staff recommendation, then we have it, but it sounded like the motion was a little bit different from that, and I just wanted to clarify that before. And by the way, I would suggest, Mr. Chair, that we conduct the vote by a roll call when we're ready to conduct the vote.
So what do you need to clarify?
If it's the staff recommendation, nothing, but if it's any variation of that, then I just want to make sure we're clear in understanding what the motion is.
Approve the report and transmittal statement and correction for errata.
Well, I think there was the correction of holding it, and then the request to bring it back annually.
Right.
Those were the two.
So the bolding, bringing it back on an annual basis, is that enough clarification?
Yeah, so that's, and for the audience's benefit, the motion is to recommend the commission approve the final report. Copies of it were out on the table. With a couple of change, well, with one change, meaning the bolding of the final statement on page Roman numeral 4. And then with the added addition that we have that your executive director has the ability to correct any errata or any, non-substantive changes before we transmit. We're planning to transmit within days to DWR. But we want to give it a final review just to make sure that all the page numbers match.
Perfectly okay.
Point of order.
Done.
And that further, we have a regular reporting back in the future on what became of this and what the status is of levy programs. Did that capture the
That captures it
intention?
as far as I can tell. Don?
Yeah, I do have a question, though. So the staff recommendation is to approve the report. The qualifying language on page 2 of the transmittal letter says the commission is approving delivery of this study. And so I want to be clear about the motion. So are we approving the study, or are we basically recognizing the study and approving delivery to the State Department of Water Resources? Because, and if so, you need to clarify for me, because when I read this language versus what is contained in the staff recommendation on the motion are two different things, I believe.
Yeah, that's a good point, Commissioner Natoli. I think the intention was certainly to seek the commission's approval to transmit the report to DWR. I mean, this, and perhaps I should have given a little bit more background. The scope of work for this report was approved by the commission back in 2013. It might have been in 2014. And because of the size of the contract, this was approved by the commission at every turn. It was really beyond the authority that you grant to your executive director to let out the contract, and we wanted to make sure the commission was fully bought into the scope of work. And so there was commission involvement throughout, and that's really why it seems appropriate, even if the motion is just to direct the transmittal of the final report, instead of approving the final report. I apologize for not being a little more precise in that wording.
What we're doing, Eric, if I may, we're satisfying the agreement we had with DWR by transmitting the report. We're not approving the report.
Yeah, and I think the commission transmittal statement is really where the commission puts its stamp on what it thinks about this report. And that's, it's there as part of the report, so.
Don, you good with that?
Yeah, I am, but so I think the motion ought to reflect what you just said, Mr. Chair, and certainly what Eric responded to, that we're approving the transmittal report. We received the report, we're approving the transmittal of the report. But yeah, but that's different than
approving the report.
Yep.
Gotcha.
That's the motion.
Yeah, we just had a quick
Conferred with
conferral here.
counsel,
We're in good shape. I apologize for not being with
we
you.
got a thumbs up, so we're good.
We don't need to say it again.
Does everyone,
if you're ready to vote, everyone just needs to be sure they know what they're voting on.
Yeah. Everybody comfortable?
Transmittal.
Transmittal. Okay, roll call vote.
Okay. Chair Thompson,
Yes.
Vice Chair Villegas,
Yes.
Commissioner Natoli,
Aye.
Commissioner Wynn,
Yes.
Commissioner Burgess,
Yes.
Commissioner Cott,
Yes.
Commissioner Loftus,
Yes.
Commissioner Biaggi,
Yes.
Commissioner Van Lobenfels,
Yes.
Commissioner Bush,
Yes.
Commissioner Ruiz,
Yes.
Commissioner Flournoy,
Yes.
Commissioner Moffett, and Commissioner Ferrara.
Yes.
Well, I want to thank the commission. I want to thank the public. It was 2 hard years, but we finally got a product that I think we can be proud of in the sense that we completed the agreement and we pointed out that there are a number of issues involved that ought to have those that are most impacted to have a seat at the table, if you will, and to try to capture those that benefit from the exports of the water in some way. So anyway, I want to thank all of you that were involved. It was a great process. So,
Well, and a special thank you to you, Mr. Chair, and the members of the subcommittee, and for the benefit of the audience and maybe even for commission members, that was a unanimous vote, 14 aye votes.
very good. Well, thank you. Okay, item 10, AB 2441, Assembly Member Frazier's bill on abandoned and derelict vessels.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll be brief here. It's not often that we bring legislation before the commission for a formal position. We last did it on legislation regarding the Delta Levee Subvention Program and maintaining the existing cost share provision. And knowing of the commission's interest in the abandoned and derelict vessel issue, I thought it was appropriate to bring this piece of legislation before you and ask if you wish to take a commission position on it. In essence, the bill by Assemblymember Frazier would redirect rental income that State Lands Commission receives from its leases in Delta counties, and in this case, it's the 5 Delta counties. It doesn't include Alameda, even though Alameda technically has a little sliver of the Delta, and would redirect that money, which currently flows to the State General Fund, redirect that money for the benefit of removing abandoned and derelict vessels, and especially commercial vessels, which, as you all probably remember from the presentation we had several months back, recreational vessels receive support from Division of Boating and Waterways to clean up abandoned watercraft. We obviously have more to do in that regard. But commercial vessels, barges, working ships, anything non-recreational out there is a very significant problem throughout the Delta. And there's really no designated funding source for removing those vessels from the waterway. So Assemblymember Frazier really gets a lot of credit for coming up with a pretty unique source of funding, and actually one with a really appropriate nexus to the problem in terms of the leases from the State Lands Commission being redirected to remove this problem in the Delta. The bill has support from Contra Costa County, from Recreational Boaters of California, and the State Lands Commission itself. I'll let Commissioner Bush represent it, but my understanding is they took a position in support of the concept of the bill. It's made its way out of its first policy committee, which for me is always kind of the starting point for any legislation I would bring to you for a position. And it's currently on the suspense file at the Assembly Appropriations Committee. But My recommendation, Mr. Chair, is to, that the commission support Assemblymember Frazier's Assembly Bill 2441 and direct a letter of support for the bill.
Okay. We have one card from the public. Charles Dulac, representing Assemblymember Frazier.
Good evening. I have some brief remarks on the bill. Mr. Chair, Commission members, I'm here today on behalf of Assemblymember Frazier to present on AB 2441, which will secure desperately needed funding to remove abandoned commercial vessels throughout the Delta. These vessels are a massive problem in the Delta. It's estimated there are 250 abandoned vessels, which would require $30 million to completely eradicate. These vessels pose a direct threat to the Delta, its environment, the navigation of the Delta, and the entire state's water quality. They leach asbestos, lead, petroleum, and many other dangerous toxins into our water supply. According to a recent aerial survey, there are about 54 abandoned commercial vessels in the Delta region, and it would cost an average of $500,000 per vessel to remove. Unlike recreational vessels, as Executive Director Vink mentioned, commercial vessels do not have any available funding for removal. So this would redirect state property lease revenue within those 5 Delta counties into a brand new account for the removal of abandoned commercial vessels. It would be managed by the State Lands Commission, and they would work with local agencies to remove the abandoned vessels. Assemblymember Frazier has been proud to defend the Delta for years, and this is just the latest effort in a long history of advocacy for the Delta. Recently, he was in front of the Joint Legislative Water Fix hearing, arguing for the rights of the people and communities who live and work in our Delta home. He's fought the tunnels every step of the way, and he has been a consistent champion for our region, as embodied by his past legislation, such as AB 1323, his marine debris law, and the legislation currently in front of you, AB 2441. To close, thank you for your time, and Assemblymember Frazier respectfully requests your support. I'm also here if you have any questions about the legislation. I'm happy to provide the answers that I can and take any additional questions to our legislative staff. Thanks.
Thank you, Charles. Brian, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, sure. I just want to thank Assemblymember Frazier for taking the bold lead on this. This is definitely an issue. We're strongly in support of the concept and the bill. We're currently working with Assemblymember Frazier's office and the committee chair in the Assembly to work on the language so that it's implementable. So hopefully we can get to a pathway on that so that we can make it effective. So it's not just a bill that sits there, but that we actually have the means and the mechanisms and the freedom to really go out and resolve the issue that is the focus of the bill, which is getting commercial vessels out of the waterways in the Delta. I won't go into the details of the nuances, devil's in the details, right? But I think we'll move on a pathway towards that, and we'll find out, as he said, the bill's on suspense, and we'll find out its fate maybe tomorrow, possibly, or sometime soon. So, yeah, but we're strongly in support, and we really appreciate Assemblymember Frazier's leadership on this issue.
Well, thanks State Lands as well for getting out there. Appreciate it. Todd?
Thank you. There's much to like about this bill. We know that we have significant impacts from abandoned vessels and, ranging from water quality issues to navigation concerns. But with that said, the administration has not yet taken a position on it, so I'll be abstaining.
Shall we do a roll call?
Yeah, when we're ready for that.
As stated, Contra Costa has already come out in support of this. Abandoned vessels have an environmental impact, but they also have an impact on public safety, both on recreational, and our sheriffs have been very concerned about this. So we appreciate Assemblymember Frazier's creativity and leadership on this, and I would like to make a motion that we support AB 2441.
Motion by Burgess. Is there a second? Second by Natoli. Roll call, please.
Chair Thompson.
Aye.
Vice Chair Villegas.
Aye.
Commissioner Natoli.
Aye.
Commissioner Wynn.
Yes.
Commissioner Burgess.
Yes.
Commissioner Cott.
Yes.
Commissioner Loftus.
Yes.
Commissioner Biaggi.
Yes.
Commissioner Van Lobenfels.
Yes.
Commissioner Ruiz.
Yes.
Commissioner Flournoy.
Abstain.
Commissioner Moffett. Commissioner Ferrara.
Abstain.
And I believe you missed Commissioner Bush.
I'm sorry, I did. My bad.
Yes.
You just showed so much support, I completely forgot.
If it wasn't evident.
Commissioner Bush.
Yes.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Chair, that's 11 ayes, 0 noes, 3 abstentions.
Okay, well, thank you to all. I think it's a good bill, and hopefully it'll get passed in the morass up there at the state. Okay, are there any comments or announcements? Don?
Yeah, if I could, Mr. Chair, very quickly, I know the hour's late. In a recent conversation, I had a document shared with me, Delta map, maybe folks have seen this, and it's a guide for recreational boating. Concern I have, and I guess it was put forward by the Boating and Waterways, is that the North Delta is not on the map. So the towns of Walnut Grove and Cortland, where we are this evening, aren't on the map. And I know the Delta's a big place, and there's a big map when you fold this out. And so, again, not to embarrass anybody, but I just think it's important when we talk about the Delta as a place, and whether it's the North Delta, Central Delta, South Delta, or anywhere else that's included in that, we should quickly, I mean, this is a big document, and if you couldn't fit Walnut Grove and some of the other places on there, then somebody needs to either make a smaller map or make sure that those communities don't get excluded. So I wanted to bring it to the Commissioner's attention. Again, it's a good resource. I'm not criticizing that, but I just think that those towns do exist. Real people live there, and it needs to be included in publications that come out from the state and are funded by local agencies. So, thanks.
Any other comments? Well, I did want to make a comment. Your 5 colleagues, the 5 supervisors from the Delta counties, appeared before the first Delta Conveyance Design and Construction Joint Powers Authority Board meeting held in Sacramento today to start the process to start designing and possibly implementing the tunnel project. My colleagues, I don't know if you want to make a comment, but I think we expressed our concerns for the obvious reasons and how it's going to impact the Delta. Unfortunately, there were probably 85 people in the room, of which there were 5 supervisors, Restore the Delta, and 2 from Restore the Delta. That was it from the public. It was pretty disappointing. I don't know whether they weren't notified, but this is a time that we need not be complacent. We need to keep pushing.
They meet on the 3rd Thursday of every month.
Yes, they meet on the 3rd Thursday of every month at 2 o'clock at the Galleria Library in Sacramento, obviously. So anyway, thank you to my colleagues for being there, and I guess we'll adjourn the meeting.